It's a rainy afternoon. A man in a suit walks briskly down the street, umbrella in hand, eyes fixed on his phone. On the corner, a woman huddles against the wall, soaked to the bone, shivering. Her cardboard sign reads simply, "Hungry. Anything helps." The man sees her. For a brief second, something stirs in his chest. A pang of sadness, a flicker of guilt. Then he looks away. The light turns green. He keeps walking. This tiny moment is what most people call compassion. But is it? Is it compassion just because he felt bad? Because something in him reacted? Because a part of his heart whispered, "Poor woman," before his mind replied, "There's nothing I can do." Let's pause here. Because this is where so many of us get it wrong. We've been taught that compassion is a feeling. That if you care, if you hurt for others, if you feel empathy, then you're compassionate. But in the eyes of the Buddha, feeling isn't enough. In Buddhism, the word for compassion is Karu, letter 1E47 a macron. It doesn't mean pity. It doesn't even mean sympathy. It means the active desire to relieve suffering. Active, Karu, letter 1E47 a macron, isn't passive emotion. It's the movement of the heart that says, "I cannot sit idly by. I must ease this pain." Think about fire. A spark might be warm, but it won't heat a house unless it becomes flame. Emotion is the spark. Compassion is when the spark becomes action. And yet, in the modern world, we often confuse one for the other. We scroll through tragedies online, feel sad for a second, maybe even cry. Then we go back to our coffee, our emails, our lives. We think we've been compassionate because we felt something. But that's not compassion. That's emotional stimulation. It soothes us. It makes us feel like good people. But it doesn't help the one who's hurting. There's an ancient Zen story. A monk was sweeping the courtyard when he saw a scorpion struggling in a puddle. He reached in to save it and got stung. He dropped it. It fell back in. He reached again, stung again. Another monk saw and said, "Why do you keep helping when it hurts you?" The first monk replied, "Because compassion doesn't ask if it's convenient. It only asks if someone is suffering." This is compassion in action. It's not polite. It's not always easy. It stings, but it moves. It responds. It does something. You see, real compassion doesn't stay in the head. It travels down into the hands, into the voice, into the body. It speaks. It lifts. It shares. And often it does so quietly. You don't need to start a movement. You don't need to fix the world. You don't need cameras rolling or likes or applause. You just need to ask, what can I do right now with what I have to ease someone's pain? Even if it's a smile, even if it's sitting beside someone in silence, even if it's just choosing not to add more harm. The Buddha once said, if you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your path. But notice he didn't say, feel sorry for someone. He said, light the lamp, do something. Compassion is not the ache you feel in your chest. It's what your hands reach for because of that ache. And when enough of us move from ache to action, the world changes. There's a quiet revolution waiting to happen, not in loud speeches or emotional hashtags, but in how we show up, how we listen, how we act when no one's watching. Compassion isn't just what we feel. It's who we choose to be, moment to moment. And maybe, just maybe, the next time it rains, and we see someone shaking in the cold, we won't just feel a flicker of sorrow. Maybe we'll stop, maybe we'll kneel, maybe we'll offer more than a glance, because in that one act, we become more than witnesses. We become the light someone's been hoping for. And from there, something deeper begins to unfold. There's something strange about the human heart. It can ache for strangers across the globe, and yet remain silent when someone close is breaking. We can cry over a news story, share a sad post, type praying for you with sincerity, and then walk past a coworker who's quietly drowning in anxiety. It's not that we don't care. We do, but somewhere along the way, compassion got replaced with performance. We mistake emotional intensity for virtue. We think the deeper we feel, the more moral we are. The more our hearts break, the more good we must be. But Buddhism teaches something radically different. The Buddha didn't praise how deeply someone felt. He praised how wisely someone acted. Because feeling isn't the end, it's the beginning. Here's the trap: we feel sorrow and it hurts. So we cry, we talk about it, we reflect. We post something meaningful and we feel better. We've released the pain, not theirs, but ours. And then we stop. We go no further. The compassion stayed in our emotional world. It comforted us, not them. It became self-soothing. There's a term for this in modern psychology: empathy fatigue. The mind gets overwhelmed by the suffering it sees, so it withdraws. It says, "I've done enough, I felt something." But Buddhism invites us into a different rhythm. It doesn't ask us to carry everyone's pain endlessly. It simply says, don't confuse your emotion with your action. Imagine a mother hearing her child cry at night. She feels the tug in her chest: exhaustion, worry, love. Now picture her lying in bed, eyes closed, whispering to herself, "Oh, poor baby, I feel so bad," but she doesn't get up. She stays there, comforting herself with her own sympathy. That's not cruelty, but it's not compassion either. Real compassion is what gets you out of bed. It's what makes you move beyond emotion into effort. It doesn't ask how much you feel. It asks, what are you willing to give? And here's the twist most people don't expect. When we act, even in small ways, the pain we feel becomes lighter. Because now, the heart is doing what it was made to do: connect, serve, heal. There's an ancient saying in Zen: the tear that falls without a hand reaching out is only half a tear. Emotion needs action to be whole. Now, that doesn't mean we need to burn ourselves out saving everyone. That's not compassion, that's delusion. But it does mean we must stay awake. We must ask ourselves, am I just feeling bad or am I doing good? Is my sadness for them or for my own relief? Is this about easing their pain or soothing my guilt? These questions aren't comfortable, but they are liberating. Because once we stop trying to feel like good people, we're free to actually become good people. A single kind word, a moment of stillness with someone in pain, a gentle act that no one sees but is deeply needed. These are the forms compassion takes when it breaks free from ego. In Buddhist practice, there's a beautiful word, Bodhisattva, the awakened heart. It doesn't just care, it moves. It becomes hands that serve, eyes that see, feet that walk towards suffering, not away from it. So next time your chest tightens at someone's pain, pause, but don't stop there. Let the feeling be a doorway. Let it lead you to something real, a phone call, a silence shared, a cup of tea offered with presence, because that's where compassion lives. Not in the heaviness of emotion, but in the lightness of doing what love quietly requires. Some people think compassion means being soft, being gentle, being agreeable. They picture a saintly smile, kind eyes, maybe folded hands. But real compassion, Karuṇā letter 1E47 macron, isn't always quiet. It doesn't always look like kindness on the surface. And it's never just a feeling. In Buddhist tradition, Karuṇā letter 1E47 macron isn't merely a human virtue. It's one of the four immeasurables, the boundless states of awakened mind. Metta, loving kindness. Karuṇā letter 1E47 macron, compassion. Mudita, empathetic joy. Upekkha, equanimity. These aren't just emotions you feel. They're trainable qualities of consciousness. They're powers that, when cultivated, liberate both you and others from suffering. Karuṇā letter 1E47 macron is born from a clear seeing of suffering. But it's shaped by something even more important, wisdom, prajna. Because here's the paradox, You can mean well and still cause harm. You can act from emotion and still reinforce suffering. Without wisdom, compassion becomes sentimentality. It becomes impulsive help that enables, or emotional rescue that creates dependence, or kindness that avoids hard truths because it wants to be liked. True Karu letter 1E47 macron doesn't do any of that, because it sees clearly. It understands that to truly help someone, you must also see through illusion, not just their illusion, but your own. Your need to be the rescuer, your discomfort with their pain, your fear of being rejected if you say what they don't want to hear. Karu letter 1E47 macron cuts through all of it. In one sutra, a monk asks the Buddha, "How should we treat those who are suffering?" The Buddha replies, "With compassion, but not blind compassion, with the eye of wisdom." Because the goal of compassion in Buddhism is not to make people feel better in the moment. It's to help them become free. Think of a child who wants candy before dinner. You say no, they cry, they suffer. Do you give in just because you feel bad? Or do you hold the boundary lovingly, firmly, knowing what's best? That's Karu letter 1E47 macron. It sees past temporary discomfort toward long-term freedom. The Bodhisattva, the awakened one who delays their own nirvana to help others, is the perfect embodiment of this. They walk into the burning house of samsara, not with pity, but with precision, not with tears in their eyes, but with clarity in their gaze and compassion in their hands. They don't just sit and cry with the suffering. They offer a way out. And if that path requires truth, even when it hurts, they still offer it. Because love without truth is incomplete, and truth without love is unbearable. Karu letter 1E47 macron lives in the space where both meet. It's the parent who holds a child through withdrawal, the friend who speaks up when you're spiraling, the teacher who gives you no answers, only the tools to see. It's not emotional saviorhood, it's awakening shared. And that's the beauty of Buddhist compassion. It doesn't elevate the helper above the one who suffers. It reminds us that there is no real separation. Your pain is not separate from mine. Your liberation is not separate from mine. When I help you rise, I rise too. Karu letter 1E47 macron doesn't need to be dramatic. It doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it's just the choice to stay, to not turn away, to hold the discomfort, to speak the truth with a soft voice. And sometimes it's fierce, a compassionate no, a boundary drawn to protect both hearts, a silence held when words would only confuse. In Zen, there's a saying, compassion is not sentiment. It is cutting through illusion. This is the wisdom behind Karu letter 1E47 macron. It's not about how much you feel. It's about how clearly you see and how bravely you respond. So if you truly want to be compassionate, don't just ask, "How do I feel about this person's pain?" Ask instead, what helps them awaken from it? That's not always what they want, but it may be exactly what they need. And sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is walk with someone through the fire, not to carry them out, but to show them that they were never alone in it. There's a kind of compassion that never makes headlines. No one claps for it. No one writes about it. It doesn't trend. It doesn't shout, but it saves lives. A nurse holds the trembling hand of a patient with no family. A janitor leaves an extra blanket on a homeless man's bench. A teacher notices a quiet student hasn't eaten lunch and quietly offers hers. These are not grand gestures. They are small, almost invisible, but in the eyes of the suffering, they shine brighter than any sermon or speech. Because compassion, real compassion, isn't about being seen. It's about seeing what others miss, hearing what goes unspoken, offering not what is impressive, but what is needed, We live in a world obsessed with visibility. We're taught that impact means attention, that if no one sees your kindness, it doesn't count. But Buddhism whispers something different. It says the most powerful acts of compassion are often done when no one is watching. There's a story of a monk who spent his entire life sweeping the monastery paths before dawn, not because they were dirty, but because he wanted the other monks to walk in peace without even realizing why. He never told anyone, he just swept for 40 years, and when he died, no one remembered his name. But every morning, long after he was gone, the path still felt soft beneath their feet. That is the heart of Karuṇā letter 1e47 awaken. Not loud at all, but deeply, unfailingly present. You see, compassion doesn't always look like intervention. Sometimes it looks like presence. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it's just the choice to stay with someone in pain, instead of fixing, teaching, or escaping. In Buddhism, there's a sacred form of compassion called non-doing. It means we don't rush to solve. We don't impose our version of help. We simply offer our full presence, awake, grounded, open. It's the kind of compassion that says, I see your pain. I won't abandon it. I won't look away. I will sit here until you remember you're not alone. And the beauty is, you don't need special training to offer this. You don't need to be a monk or a healer. You just need to care enough, to pause, to notice, to do the next kind thing without waiting for recognition. A soft word when someone is sharp, a deep breath when you want to react, a meal cooked with love, a message sent at just the right time. These are not small things. They are sacred. They are the threads that hold the fabric of this world together. Quietly, patiently, endlessly. The Buddha once said, if you knew what I know about the power of generosity, you would not let a single day pass without sharing something. But generosity isn't always material. Sometimes the most generous gift is your attention, your steadiness, your willingness to see someone clearly and stay. In a time when everyone wants to be heard, what a miracle it is to be the one who listens. In a world rushing to do more, how rare it is to simply be with someone. That is not passivity. It is presence. It is power. It is Karuṇā letter 1e47 awaken in its most grounded form. So if you've ever wondered whether your kindness matters, if you've ever questioned whether holding the door, checking in on a friend, or offering someone your full attention is enough, let this be your reminder. Compassion isn't measured by volume. It's measured by sincerity, by whether it comes from a quiet ego or a quiet soul. And in the end, it is these quiet acts, the unnoticed, the uncelebrated, that form the invisible architecture of love in this world. You may never know whose pain you softened, whose day you brightened, whose life you helped steer away from the edge, but that doesn't make it any less real. So keep offering, keep choosing kindness even when no one sees it, because someone always feels it, and that is the quiet miracle of great compassion. There's a story told in silence every day. A person stands at a crossroad, not the kind you see on a map, but the kind that hides in ordinary moments. Do I reply with kindness or irritation? Do I listen fully or pretend to care? Do I speak gently or let frustration win? These are the invisible forks in the road we face, not once a lifetime, but hundreds of times a day. And every choice we make, each one, is a vote for the kind of world we're building. Compassion isn't always some dramatic act of service. It's not about giving away everything you own or quitting your job to save the world. Sometimes it's choosing not to raise your voice, or answering a message even when you're tired, or remembering to smile at the cashier who's clearly having a rough day. These moments may seem small, but in the eyes of the person receiving them, they can be everything. There's a man who always leaves a sticky note on his daughter's lunch box. Some days it's a joke, some days it's a drawing, some days it's just, "You've got this." She never says much about them, until one day he forgets. That evening she quietly asks, "Did something happen today?" Because for her that note wasn't just paper, it was presence. It was love showing up in a tiny, consistent form. That's what active compassion looks like. Not loud, not heroic, but steady, intentional, quietly transformative. In Buddhism, there's a practice called right action, part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's not just about morality, it's about awareness in motion. Every action becomes a mirror of your inner state. Every word, a seed you plant in the world. And the question is never, how big was your gesture, but rather, how awake were you when you made it? Because when we act with compassion, we're not just helping others. We're shaping who we are, not in theory, but in real time. You don't have to wait for a grand opportunity to show compassion. You already have 1,000 chances. In your kitchen, in traffic, in meetings, on the phone, in line at the store. Each one is a sacred chance to say, "I see you, you matter, I won't add more harm here." A man once told the Buddha, "I'm not wise, I'm not holy, I don't meditate. What can I possibly do that's good?" The Buddha answered, "Then do this, stop harming, start helping. That is enough to begin your awakening." That teaching never gets old. Because sometimes the most powerful shift is not in what you start doing, but what you stop doing. You stop interrupting, you stop judging, you stop assuming the worst. And in that space, something tender appears. Room for compassion, room for kindness, room for someone else to simply breathe. And the impact, you may never fully know it. You may never realize that your calm response kept someone from breaking down, or that your patient ear gave someone strength to go on, or that your simple act of presence reminded someone they're still human. But it happens. It happens all the time. In Zen, there's a phrase, "Enlightenment is when the everyday becomes sacred." That's the secret. It's not about changing the world in one sweeping gesture. It's about changing your world, one conscious, compassionate choice at a time. So the next time you're rushing through the day, and someone interrupts your schedule, or cuts you off, or drops a moment of heaviness in your lap, pause, breathe, and remember this is it. This is the moment, not later, not tomorrow. Right here is where compassion lives, and your next choice may change far more than you think. Not all compassion wears a soft smile. Sometimes it stands tall, steady, grounded, and says, "No, this ends here." Because true compassion isn't always about making people feel good. Sometimes it's about protecting what's good, even if that means disappointing someone, even if that means walking away, even if that means being misunderstood. There's a misconception floating around. That kindness always looks agreeable. That compassion is about saying yes, accommodating others, never rocking the boat. But that's not compassion. That's people-pleasing wrapped in fear. Compassion with wisdom knows, when you let harm continue, even in silence, you're participating in it. And the most loving thing you can sometimes do is stop enabling it. Picture a mother tiger. She is fiercely protective. She nurtures, yes, but also growls when danger comes near. Would you say she lacks compassion when she bares her teeth to defend her cubs? Of course not, because protection is compassion. So why do we forget that when it comes to ourselves? There's a form of compassion the Buddha taught that often goes unnoticed. UPEK, letter 1E63, macron, equanimity. It's the inner strength to stay centered, not swayed by flattery or blame, not pulled into emotional whirlpools. When someone tries to manipulate you, or guilt trip you, or use your kindness as a weakness, compassion doesn't say, "Let them." It says, "I see you're suffering, but I won't be a doorway for it." That's fierce compassion. It doesn't shout, it doesn't shame, but it also doesn't bend to fear or guilt. It stands in truth. It recognizes that loving others doesn't mean losing yourself. And that kindness with boundaries is far more sustainable than kindness with resentment. A Zen master was once asked, "What do you do when someone takes advantage of your compassion?" He replied, "I let them learn from the closed door." Saying no can be the highest act of love. No, I won't continue this cycle. No, I won't let your chaos become my home. No, I won't abandon myself to keep you comfortable. But here's the beautiful paradox. That no isn't a rejection of the person. It's a rejection of the harm. It's not, "I don't care about you." It's, "I care too much to let this continue." In the life of a Bodhisattva, one who vows to help all beings awaken, compassion isn't always warm. Sometimes it's fierce. Sometimes it speaks the hard truth. Sometimes it walks away with tears in its eyes, because staying would mean betraying the Dharma within. But that doesn't make it less compassionate. It makes it real, alive, awake, balanced. So the next time you find yourself hesitating to set a boundary, ask, am I afraid of being unkind, or am I afraid of being honest? Because real kindness includes honesty, and honesty includes clarity. You can love someone and still say, "This isn't okay." You can care deeply and still walk away. You can be compassionate without being consumed. And in that space, a deeper kind of healing begins. Not just for others, but for you. So yes, sometimes compassion whispers, sometimes it embraces, and sometimes it simply says no. With love, with courage, with peace. In a quiet corner of the world, a monk tends to a sick stray dog. No audience, no camera, no applause, only care. And when the dog recovers, it limps away into the forest without even looking back. The monk smiles gently and returns to sweeping the temple floor. That is compassion without ego. We live in a world that celebrates impact. How many people did you help? How big was your donation? Did they say thank you? But true compassion doesn't ask those questions. It doesn't care about being seen. It doesn't wait for validation. It doesn't need a result to feel real. It simply acts. Because that's what love does, when it's free of the self. In Buddhism, this selfless action is called Bodhisattva, the awakened heart-mind. It doesn't operate from identity. It doesn't keep score. It doesn't say, "I helped you, you owe me." Because compassion tied to ego is just performance. It looks like care, but it's quietly asking for something in return. Maybe praise, maybe belonging, maybe a sense of superiority. And when it doesn't get those things, it becomes bitter. It feels used. It stops giving. That's how we know ego was hiding underneath the robe of compassion. Real compassion doesn't need to be thanked. It feels complete just by acting in alignment with truth. Like the sun, it shines on all, even those who curse it, even those who take it for granted. The Buddha once cared for a monk who was sick and left alone. He cleaned his wounds, washed his body, fed him. And when the others asked why he did such lowly work, he answered, "He who would serve me must serve the sick." No pride, no show, just presence. Ego wants to do something great. Compassion just wants to relieve suffering. Ego says, "Look at what I've done." Compassion says, "May you be well." And it walks away, without waiting for acknowledgement. But here's the paradox. When you act without expectation, something beautiful happens. The heart becomes light. There's no pressure to fix everything. No burden of being good enough. No resentment if things don't change. You helped because helping was the right thing to do, and that is enough. This is the power of compassion without attachment, an offering placed into the river of life, not knowing where it will flow, a kindness given without a receipt, a smile shared with no demand for one in return. When we let go of the need to be recognized, we become unstoppable. We give more freely. We love more deeply. We serve more joyfully. Not because we want to be saints, not because we want to be seen, but because suffering is real, and we're here to meet it with open hands and steady hearts. In the Zen tradition, there's a saying, do good, but don't hang your name on it. Because when your name becomes more important than the act, you're no longer helping, you're branding. So the next time you feel the urge to post your kindness or repeat how generous you've been, pause and ask, what part of me needs to be noticed? If it's the ego, smile at it gently, then return to the stillness within you that needs nothing, but still gives everything, because that's the heart of true compassion. It gives, not to be seen, not to be loved, not to be remembered, but because someone is hurting. And you're here, that's enough. She cries, you ache, she falls, you rush in, she breaks again. And you stay long after your strength has left you. You tell yourself it's love, you call it compassion, but deep down a quiet voice wonders, am I helping her heal, or holding her up so she never learns to walk? This is the crossroads between compassion and codependency. We often confuse the two, because both look like care on the surface. Both show up, both give. Both carry burdens, but where compassion frees, codependency binds. Where compassion says, I'm here with you, codependency whispers, you can't do this without me. And slowly, loving someone becomes needing to be needed. The Buddha taught that true compassion is rooted in wisdom. That means we love without clinging, we give without controlling, and we help without losing ourselves in the pain of others. Compassion sees suffering, but doesn't drown in it. It's like standing on the shore, reaching out to someone in the river, not jumping in without a rope, because if you both sink, who will help? But codependency, it's the illusion that saving others is your purpose, that their suffering defines your worth, that unless they're okay, you're not. And so you overextend, you abandon your own peace, you become entangled emotionally, energetically, even spiritually. You forget, compassion is not martyrdom. It's not sacrifice without balance. It's not clinging to brokenness hoping to be the glue. The Buddha himself left his wife and child, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. He knew that to truly help all beings, he first had to liberate himself. His compassion was vast, but never entangled, because when your compassion is rooted in attachment, you don't just carry someone else's suffering, you become it, and soon your help isn't help anymore. It's dependence, it's control, it's fear wearing the mask of love. So how do we love without attachment? By practicing compassion with boundaries, by asking, am I doing this from love or from fear of being unloved? It means we can say, I care deeply, but I won't betray my truth to keep you comfortable. It means we can walk beside someone through their storm, but not build a house in their pain. It means we understand that growth often requires struggle, and sometimes the most compassionate act is to step back and let someone rise on their own. This is fierce compassion. It doesn't always feel soft. It doesn't always say yes. It doesn't always stay, but it's honest. It's awake. It serves not just the moment, but the deeper liberation of all involved. You are not someone's savior. You are not their source of healing. You are a mirror, a reminder, a presence. The moment you start needing their healing to feel whole, your love becomes a prison. Let it breathe. Let it be free. Let it not need to be returned. So the next time you find yourself stuck in the loop of overgiving, ask yourself gently, am I helping them or keeping them from helping themselves? And if the answer unsettles you, breathe, smile at the part of you that wants to be needed. Then let go, not from coldness, but from wisdom. Because compassion, without freedom, is not compassion at all. True love doesn't bind, it blesses. It doesn't pull others down into your boat, it builds bridges and lets them cross on their own. Sometimes the most powerful act of compassion is not to hold on, but to let go. Not all heroes wear robes, not all saints live in caves, and not all bodhisattvas are carved in stone. Some walk among us, quiet, unnoticed, but their presence changes everything. They speak gently when anger fills the room. They offer silence when words would only wound. They hold space, not for attention, but for transformation. These are the ones who live compassion, not as a gesture, but as a way of being. In Mahayana Buddhism, a bodhisattva is someone who vows not to enter final nirvana until all beings are free from suffering, not because they have to, but because their heart has become too vast, too open, to leave anyone behind. They walk through the world not seeking escape, but offering refuge. Their compassion is not occasional. It's foundational. It's not what they do. It's who they are. But here's the truth no one tells you. You don't have to be perfect to walk the bodhisattva path. You don't need a halo or a holy name. You don't need a temple. You just need this, a sincere wish for others to be free. That's where it begins. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choices. Smiling at the cashier who looks tired, listening to a friend without interrupting, choosing patience when irritation rises. Each act, no matter how small, plants the seed of awakening, because compassion is not measured by how loud it shouts, but by how deeply it listens. The bodhisattva walks into suffering, not because they enjoy pain, but because they've seen through the illusion that their happiness is separate from others. They understand, as long as even one being is in chains, none of us are truly free, so they keep returning, lifetime after lifetime, moment after moment, to serve, and service to them is not a burden, it's a privilege. But make no mistake, this path is not always soft. Sometimes compassion is confronting injustice. Sometimes it's staying present with unbearable grief. Sometimes it's choosing love, even when the world gives you every reason to close your heart. That's what makes the Bodhisattva path radical. It asks you to love without possession, to give without expectation, to act without applause. It asks you to hold the pain of the world without being crushed by it, to let your heart break so it can open wider. And yet in all of this, there is no ego, because a true bodhisattva does not think, "I'm saving the world." They simply respond, like a hand instinctively reaching to pull the body away from fire. They act not out of pride, but out of understanding. This is interbeing. This is non-duality. This is knowing that helping others is helping yourself. Because ultimately, there is no other. In a society that tells you to get ahead, the bodhisattva pauses to lift someone else. In a culture obsessed with success, they redefine it as awakening. They're not perfect, they stumble. They get frustrated, they fall, but they always return to the vow, "May all beings be free, may my life be of benefit." In that vow is stronger than any fear. You don't have to shave your head. You don't have to leave your family. You just have to love, fiercely, quietly, continuously. Hold that love even when it's inconvenient, even when no one sees, even when it hurts, because that is the path. The bodhisattva doesn't wait for a perfect world. They help create it. One breath, one act, one moment at a time. So the question is no longer, am I compassionate enough? But rather, am I willing to keep opening my heart, even when it would be easier to close it? And if the answer is yes, even just a whisper of a yes, then the bodhisattva lives in you too, not as an idea, but as a choice, a way of life, a quiet, relentless revolution of the heart. At first, compassion feels like a choice. Something you summon, something you try to do, something you offer when you're strong enough, when you're calm enough, when you're not too tired or too hurt. But one day something shifts. You stop trying to be compassionate and simply are. It doesn't roar, it doesn't sparkle, it doesn't demand to be noticed. It just moves through you. Like breath, like silence, like still water reflecting the sky. This is the still heart. A heart that doesn't rush to fix, doesn't panic in the face of pain, doesn't need to prove anything. It simply holds, listens, responds when it's needed, waits when it's not. It's no longer a reaction or even a decision. It's a presence, effortless, unshaken, whole. And here's the secret no one tells you. When compassion becomes your nature, you don't feel like a hero. You feel ordinary, peacefully, beautifully ordinary. You still feel anger, you still get tired. But something deep inside no longer clings. You don't carry the weight of the world. You walk beside it, you let it speak, you let it be, and in doing so, you free yourself too. This is not the end of a journey, it's a return to the simplicity you've always known, to the innocence before the world taught you to close off, to the softness that never truly left. Compassion is not something you have to build, it's something you have to remember. Strip away the fear, the ego, the grasping. And there it is, always was. You don't need a title, you don't need followers, you don't need perfect circumstances. You just need stillness. And in that stillness, a fierce, quiet love rises. Not because you want to be good, not because someone told you to, but because nothing else makes sense anymore. Because separation is an illusion, and in seeing through it, you begin to touch everything, gently, wholly, without agenda. You see a stranger's tears, and feel no urge to flee. You hear the anger in someone's voice, and don't shrink or retaliate. You sit with your own pain, and hold it like a crying child. There is no drama, no ego trip, no need for credit, just an open palm, a steady breath, a still heart, and the world, this chaotic, aching world, feels it. It may not change overnight, but it softens because you have softened. It listens because you have learned to listen. And somewhere, a heart that was about to close decides to stay open just a little bit longer, all because you chose to live this way, not for applause, not for heaven, but because it's the truest thing you know. So here we are, not at the end, but at the beginning of something deeper. You don't have to try harder, you don't have to be someone else. You just have to be still and let compassion arise, not as a task, but as your very nature, a love that doesn't shout, a wisdom that doesn't waver, a heart that doesn't need to move, because it already holds everything. This is your path now, not a straight line, but a living rhythm, and wherever you go, let it go with you, quietly, gently, unshakably, like the still heart you've always had.